Interviewing Rick today is Paul Fromberg, who is currently the rector of St. Gregory's, the church that Rick co-founded. And I'm delighted to invite him to be in conversation with Rick for the first 30 minutes of the session. In the second 30 minutes of the session, we will be happy to take questions from you all. Thank you so much, Rick, and thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Matthew. Rick, it is good to see you. Even at a distance, it's good to see you. And it's a delight to see so many friends and colleagues and others that have come to be with us today for the conversation. Rick, number one, how are you doing in the Corona tide?
I'm doing just fine, thank you very much. My husband, Steve, cooks wonderfully. In fact, every meal is better than the last one. So
you're actually managing to keep your weight on. That's good.
Yes, that was not hard.
We don't want you to waste away.
No.
Your book, Rick, has been such a gift to so many people. Certainly it has been to me. When we spoke about this some months ago, I said that I had that feeling when I read the book of sort of, it's almost as if a memory is coming back to me, because so much of what you write is so deeply embedded in the culture of St. Gregory's. So much of the practice that we take up is enlivened by the book. And I recall that at our last conversation, we had some specific points that we covered. And I wanted to go back to only a couple of those, but really wanted to ask you some additional questions. And one of them is sort of a foundational question that I'd like to get into before we go into the more substantial question, which is the question about marriage. And I want to talk to you about what is the easiest way to ask this question. How about this? Hey, Rick, what is a sacrament?
That's actually the Latin word is where only the Latins use it. The Greeks never use that. And so, and the Latin word is borrowing a military analogy. Roman soldiers fought in pairs, and they had an oath of allegiance. And if one of them defected and left, the other was probably executed. So it was a very powerful promise to make. And Roman law gave that, people generally made contracts with conditions like that. So the idea, the fundamental rationale about calling something a sacrament, not all rites have that title in the Latin tradition, and as I say, the Greeks don't even use it. But it is the fundamental idea is that a sacrament is a promise from God. If you do this, I will be there. You don't have to wonder, where is God? What, has he shown up? Or she? What is she doing? If you do this, I will be there. That makes a sacrament like a Roman soldier making.
So the sacraments that we experience when we gather as the community are given to us as a sort of surety, a sort of a warrant that God is with us. We don't have to worry about it. We don't have to become neurotic about it. We just have to show up.
That's absolutely the case.
So yeah, please.
I can remember when I was in seminary, and I began to wonder if I was making all this up, and if any of this had ever had any reality to it, or it was just stuff in books. Mm-hmm. And I took great comfort from the knowledge that in baptism, if there's a God, the very molecules of water, of hydrogen and oxygen atoms and so forth, are witnesses that I have put God on. I don't ever have to doubt that God is involved. If there's no God, of course, we have other plans. But if there is and by the way, that is one of the distinctive characters of classical monotheism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and Hinduism, which are the classical monotheist culture, religion traditions, and all the little spur groups, is not that there is a God. It's rather that God's job is filled. Somebody's doing it. And so what I discovered in that quandary in seminary was, I have the molecules witnessing that God, I have put God on, and God has clothed me, and it is if there is no God, she won't do anything, but otherwise she's active wherever she goes.
The sacraments give us a way in which we are sharing and doing the work of God.
Yes, they do. They enable us to join in. I think in fact, what they give us, if you look at, take a text like Matthew's Beatitudes, spell out a life, just a short description of how humans how humans are built to live. We're actually designed to live like that. We don't, but we're actually designed to. And they are, that is spelling out how God is calling all humankind to live. It is all the Christian rites that we call sacraments, and some are more than that. They're signs. They don't make Christians any different from other people. Instead they are Christian signs of how God is calling all people everywhere to live, and God is busily doing that. God does not need us or the church or any of that in order to do that, but we have the lucky role of joining in the company of enrolling people to join us.
Is the joy of that invitation that we're able to extend? I mean, it is as if we are actually extending ourselves and the divine spirit that God shares with us to those people. It's as if we are offering God's invitation on God's behalf, not in an arrogant way, but in a sort of generous way.
Oh, absolutely. And the Bible is full of people who did the same thing. All the prophets responded that way. Many of them didn't really want the job. And so
some clergy too.
Yeah, some clergy don't want the job either. But it's one of the things we sign up for.
Yeah.
And it is one of the satisfactions is discovering that once you sign up and join into the task, you begin to see God at work everywhere, not just in the church, everywhere.
It's a very critical point these days as we live in a pandemic where we are showing love by staying physically isolated from each other. And I know a lot of my colleagues and others who have too much time on their hands and post too much on Facebook have a lot of opinions about, for example, our inability to share in the Eucharist because of physical distancing. And I wonder about the sacramental grace of the Eucharist when we are apart from each other. I wonder what takes the place of Eucharist when we are no longer able to be with each other. How do we fill that space in our lives?
Well, in the first place, the Eucharist is a sign of what God is doing. And when we don't see what God is doing, God is still doing it. That is the most important thing to get from this, the notion that it's a sign. We are not actually we don't make anything happen in the Eucharist. God makes everything happen there. And God has poured the Spirit, which is the Spirit of Christ, out on all humankind. It's everywhere. So that Spirit is everywhere. So what we have, luckily for us, is the knowledge in the Eucharist that God is at work, and it's sometimes the experience of it. That is even an inner experience that comes, as you say, you might even say for free. the the biblical doctrine of sacrifice was not that you give something up, but that God gives human beings new life for free. And that's what we have in the Eucharist, the sacrifice of the Eucharist, which commemorates Jesus laying down his life for his friends, an existential sacrifice, if you like. And God pours Jesus' life out for free. That doesn't mean that for people who sign up and join the church. It means everywhere. The Spirit is everywhere. And so when we don't have the communion, that's a novel experience for Americans, but there are plenty of Christians in prison around the world, in oppression and prison, who do not have the bread and the wine Eucharist. Nevertheless, the promise that those are signs of operates. God promises to be there.
Again, it is God's business.
Yes.
It is God's authority, if you will.
Yes.
To show up in our lives this way.
Very
you said
good. Very good for you to say authority, Paul, because the Tavistock movement, which gives us all of our modern study groups and so forth, defined, after studying all kinds of terrible examples, decided that to define authority as the ability to do work. So when you speak of God's authority, you're talking about God at work, exactly what we have in the Eucharist.
The sacramental sign that you have written about in your new book, that you think of as the one which is most defining, is marriage. And I'm fascinated by that, because so much of the liturgical movement in the last 100 years has really been about sort of emphasizing baptism as the keystone to the church's identity. And you're throwing a piece of red meat into the arena when you say maybe it's matrimony and maybe not baptism. I would love to hear you say more about it.
Well, yes, I'd be happy to. In the first place, I hope I have made clear that far from having anything against baptism, I consider it personally enormously important for me. It's part of my emotional salvation in those years, was that I could reassure myself about my relationship with God, because at least there were witnesses. The water molecules are the witnesses. But the church has focused our attention about Christian rights, usually on the basis of what people were fighting about at the time. For the first 3 or 4 centuries, there was a lot of fighting about baptism. This fighting reemerged in the 19th century in America. Thank goodness we don't listen to it anymore, but there are times when it came back and people fought about baptism. And I remember Bill Swing, our former bishop, quoting a common response of people when he was a minister in the American South. He said somebody would come up to him and say, "Do you believe in infant baptism?" And his answer was, "Believe in it? I've seen it." And he had the same response to people who asked him, "Do you believe in the ordination of women? Do you believe in it? I've seen it." So there is what I think about the next focus of fighting, of course, was what happens in the Eucharist. Now, if anybody among our listeners can define what is happening in Eucharist, rush out and print a book about it, because there just isn't any way to define what is happening. No, they've been fighting about that for centuries, for 3 or 4 centuries now. I'm suggesting that that instead of placing one of those two in the center and trying to match all the other rites and sacraments to make them fit just like that, like those, that the best one to put in the center, and maybe even as a model governing the others, but to put as a center of our thinking, is matrimony. And I can give you, if you like, a couple of reasons. Have I bored you yet?
No, I am absolutely not bored.
One of the reasons why this sign is a good center is that it's everywhere. there is we up until what was it's up and it's everywhere, not just in the church but everywhere. And the churches have always been very good about honoring marriages that are made outside of Christianity. If one spouse becomes a Christian, the marriage is not over. That's and it's one of the things that you might expect another outfit would have done was, well, that dissolves the marriage, but the churches have not done that. Marriage is everywhere, and the
interesting kind of way that people talk about marriage. Some people want to talk about Christian marriage as opposed to just marriage.
well,
And in some jurisdictions, you can actually get a marriage license for Christian marriage. And you would argue that is ridiculous.
I think if those people are also issuing licenses for Jewish marriage and Muslim marriage and so forth, I suppose it makes a kind of administrative sense, but it doesn't make any theological sense.
No.
So if I think that a Christian marriage is a marriage done by that Christians are doing, and and as I say, the marriage is everywhere. It seems to be part of our native structure. There are other animals that have that same quality as part of their structure. Some birds, some and so forth. We have this everywhere. That's one. Also good.
What is the genius of marriage? What is the thing that that defines marriage or makes marriage?
Well, I think let me give you another reason I like it. This, which defines it, I think, which helps to define it. Is your it's progressive. It starts out, people have the crazy idea, I don't know why this is so common, that you have to fall in love, and after that you spend all of your time trying to recover that. So that there are denominations who assume that if there's a divorce, it's because something was wrong from the beginning. And Daphne DeMarneff, who is one of the interviewers on this series, has a wonderful book on about marriage. She's done a lot of marriage counseling. And says people tell them to give themselves an identity. People tell themselves that the story, they tell themselves a story. And if the story's wrong at the beginning, well, of course, it's going to have a bad ending. And if there's trouble now, it must be something was wrong from the beginning. Maybe their identity isn't, they were the wrong identity. I married the wrong person. Many couples have the wonder if they have married the wrong person. I'm sure my poor long-suffering husband wonders about that. But it is as Daphne says, the wonderful thing about marriage is that the people build their identity together. Now that they come together, but their real identity is what they build together. It's progressive, and that I think is essential. It's not unique to marriage. Martin Luther said the same thing about baptism. Martin Luther said the important thing about baptism is not the water bath. It's the life and progress of virtue that follows it. That's the core of baptism. So, and I think marriage is like that. It has that progressive character. And you don't know where you're going, but you will discover greater blessings than you could have imagined.
I tell couples when I'm preparing them for marriage, doing a little pastoral conversation with them, that the most surprising thing about marriage is that you go from being two individuals to being a sort of a network, and that there's always this third person in the relationship of marriage, which is the marriage itself. It's as if there is a new entity that is within you, between you, around you, that other people will relate to. I mean, it's a sociological thing as well. People treat a couple differently than they treat a single. And I recognize this identity with my husband in our marriage, that there is this thing between us that has an existence of its own, that is created, I suppose, by sacramental grace.
Yes, I think, well, grace is creative all the time.
Yes.
So, and when I want to be, when talking about this, to make sure that I'm not distinguishing marriage from, in some, especially Christian marriage, from other kinds, because grace is not limited to anything. Grace means getting for free what you have not earned. There is, so we have that, and that happens in marriage. And I like the Hebrew word baruch, which is blessing, means incalculable riches. You could never predict this. You could never add it all up, and this is how it would end. Baruch is always more good than you could possibly calculate and justify. So and marriage has that, as the other rights have. One of the things, the reasons I like to place it at the center of our chart of human right, of Christian rights and signs that we practice together, is the importance of desire in marriage. Mm-hmm. It is baptism is the only sacrament really that asks, where the Book of Common Prayer asks, voices desire. Do you desire to be baptized? That question comes to us from the Sarum Rite, and so it's been with us Anglicans since the Middle Ages. Do you desire to be baptized? The answer was, I will, spelt with a Y, W-Y-L-L. And if you would have the primacy of marriage, of desire in marriage, is central. People generally grant that it is. Even, let's say, in I don't know if it's the majority of the world, but a very large proportion of the world, marriages are arranged. And they are not always between people who fell in love with each other at the start. The love may come as they live together, and so forth. And yet, it is so, people who grew up around arranged marriages, as most of the people in India have, many young people in India still ask their parents to arrange a marriage for them, because that's what they grew up with, and they are grateful for it. So but the desire that's there is essential. It's not, we don't require desire of all the other sacraments, but this one is, everybody understands. First of all, desire, and secondly, the fruits of desire, children.
I was wondering, as you were talking, there's a sense of desire as passion, affection. There's also a sense of desire as aspiration, of hope. Sort of, I don't know what I'm getting into, but my desire is that it is good. Which, certainly in the context of something like arranged marriage, where there may or may not be affection initially, gives a way forward, so that desire is not just hot passion, but desire is also a kind of volitional thing. It's something I will do.
One of the I think unfortunate part of the unfortunate heritage we have from the Latin West is a fear of desire. And a fear of passion and so forth. And it's not just Latin. That is generally, it comes into, spoils Christian church living. It's a fear of desire and passion. And there are some writers figured, well, that's the important thing to do in the virtuous life is get rid of the passions. Gregory of Nyssa, our patron saint, reckoned the other way. Right. That all of God, all of humanity, all of the creation is good, including our passions. And God gives us, and animals too, passions for their own good. Only human beings misdirect them. And what we need to do is learn how to direct them the way they are meant to be directed. And and I think this is true of marriage. I think what matters is, what do you do with this desire? What are you going to do with the passion that you feel? Not suppress it, not prune it away. What will you do with it for good?
One of the challenges and gifts of marriage is the longevity of it. So that you actually are, in so many ways, a different person after 5, 10, 20, 50, 70 years of marriage. So that you're constantly having to re-engage the question of desire in relationship.
When you mention longevity, you're bringing up the other distinctive feature it has, which is expressed in the ritual. Until we are parted by death. Death, this is the only it's the only, well, of course, the Office for the Burial of the Dead does mention death, naturally, but the others don't. And yet death, the connection between love and death is very strong in human experience. And it is after all of us, even those of us who were celibate, and some of my finest teachers were celibate, have been and still are. They have chosen a path outside marriage, but they all grew up in a marriage, nearly all, and they're grateful for it. And they have watched, all of us get to watch one partner, one spouse in a marriage survive the death of the other. It's a terrible pain. And the pain of a marriage and divorce is the same thing. I have a friend who thought, a priest friend who thought when he got a divorce that his bishop would defrock him. No, said the bishop, divorce is like pneumonia. You would not wish it on anybody. And there is, and the Greeks are much wiser about this, recognizing that a divorce is a death. It's like the death of a spouse. And all of us, in understanding marriage, understand that it confronts death. Daily, we confront death in marriage. And not all of the rites are so explicit about that. That's one of the reasons I think it kind of governs the others.
It's interesting, and I know we're going to go to questions here in just a moment, but it's interesting because in my experience, at least in marriage, death is also a sort of companion along the way. I mean, there are things I've had to die to in my marriage. The experience of singleness, being the most obvious thing. I cannot be a single person and be a married person, so I have to die to that. And yet, because of God's pernicious desire to keep forcing life on us, even in the midst of death, we find life.
Yes. One of one of the features of human history is there has never been a period when writers did not say, things were better before this. Things were more natural before this. Everything is screwed up now, and things are much more natural. There's more general happiness and ease and so forth in some golden age before this. This goes back as far as we have any literature. It goes back that people are saying this. And that human experience of things were better before this lingers within the mind of anybody married. That there was a time when I was single and I could do the following 20 things that I now cannot do. That's part of the human condition of our living, making progress in life. Progress always means leaving something behind.
Yes, yeah, that's an important point, and I appreciate your saying it.